The morning mist clung to Lexington Green like a shroud, as Captain John Parker positioned his 7-7 colonial militiamen in a ragged line. It was barely dawn on April 19, 1775, and the air carried more than just the chill of early spring. It carried the weight of impending revolution. Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, knew the sound of approaching boots on cobblestone. His weathered hands gripped his musket as he watched the road from Boston, where British regulars had been marching through the night. What he didn't know was that in the next few minutes, his small band of farmers and tradesmen would fire the first shots of the American Revolution. The British expedition, led by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, had left Boston under cover of darkness with a simple mission: march to Concord, destroy the colonial military supplies hidden there, and return before the rebels could organize resistance. But secrecy had already failed. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott had ridden through the countryside hours earlier, their urgent warnings echoing from farm to farm. The regulars are coming out. As the crimson-coated column of 700 British soldiers crested the hill overlooking Lexington, Major John Pitcairn spurred his horse forward. The sight before him was exactly what London had feared: armed colonists, standing in defiance of the Crown. These weren't the scattered protesters of the Boston Tea Party or the angry crowds that had surrounded British customs houses. These were organized militiamen, weapons in hand, blocking the King's Road. According to historical accounts preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society, the tension on Lexington Green was palpable as both sides faced each other across the dewy grass. Parker had given his men clear instructions: stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. His words would echo through American history, though whether he actually spoke them that morning remains debated by scholars. Pitcairn rode closer, his voice carrying across the green as he shouted for the rebels to disperse. Lay down your arms, you damned rebels! The British major's horse pranced nervously, sensing the tension that crackled between the two forces like electricity before a thunderstorm. Parker, realizing his small force was hopelessly outnumbered, began ordering his men to withdraw. They had made their point: the colonists would not be intimidated. But as the militiamen began to move away from the green, keeping their weapons, someone fired a shot. To this day, historians cannot definitively say who pulled that trigger. British soldiers later claimed the rebels fired first. Colonial witnesses swore it was a British musket that broke the morning silence. What is certain is that within seconds, the green erupted in smoke and thunder as both sides opened fire. When the shooting stopped, 8 colonists lay dead on the grass where they had stood moments before. 10 more writhed in pain from their wounds. Among the fallen was Jonathan Harrington, who crawled bleeding to his own doorstep before dying in his wife's arms. The British suffered only 1 wounded soldier, a minor injury to Pitcairn's horse. The skirmish lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but its consequences would reshape the world. As the British column reformed and marched toward Concord, smoke still rising from their muskets, they left behind more than casualties. They left behind any hope of peaceful reconciliation between Britain and her American colonies. 3 hours before dawn broke over Lexington Green, Boston's silversmith Paul Revere was already deep into the most famous ride in American history. The events that would unfold at Lexington and Concord had been set in motion days earlier, when British General Thomas Gage received orders from London to arrest the rebel leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and to destroy the military supplies. The colonists had been secretly accumulating in Concord, but the Sons of Liberty had eyes and ears throughout Boston. Dr. Joseph Warren, the Patriot leader who would later die at Bunker Hill, had learned of the British plans through his network of informants. As Warren later wrote in correspondence preserved by the Boston Public Library, the regulars are coming out tomorrow night to Lexington and Concord. The race was on to warn the countryside before 700 British soldiers could complete their mission. Revere had prepared for this moment. Earlier that week, he had arranged with Sexton Robert Newman to signal from the steeple of Old North Church, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. When Newman hung the lanterns in the tower on the night of April 18th, it confirmed that the British were crossing the harbor by boat, rather than marching out through Boston Neck. Revere's own journey almost ended before it began, as he rowed across the dark waters of Boston Harbor with 2 companions. They nearly collided with HMS Somerset, a 64-gun ship of the line anchored in the channel. The massive warship's silhouette loomed above them in the darkness. Her crew, unaware that the most important messenger in American history was slipping past just yards away. Reaching Charlestown safely, Revere mounted a borrowed horse-swift mare named Brown Beauty and thundered into the night. His route took him through Medford, where he woke Captain Isaac Hall and his Minutemen Company. At every farmhouse, every crossroads, every village, Revere's message was the same: the regulars are out. Arm yourselves and gather your companies. Meanwhile, William Dawes had taken the land route, talking his way past British sentries at Boston Neck with a combination of wit and luck. Dawes was a master of disguise and deception, often posing as a farmer or tradesman to move freely through British-controlled areas. His journey was longer, but equally crucial, as he carried the same urgent warning through Roxbury and Cambridge. The two messengers met at Lexington around midnight, where they found Samuel Adams and John Hancock staying at the parsonage of Reverend Jonas Clark Adams, the firebrand who had helped organize the Boston Tea Party, and Hancock, whose bold signature would later dominate the Declaration of Independence, were marked men. British orders specifically called for their arrest on charges of treason, a crime punishable by hanging. After rousing the Lexington militia under Captain John Parker, Revere and Dawes continued toward Concord, joined by young Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had been courting a lady in Lexington. Prescott's local knowledge would prove invaluable, as he knew every back road and forest path in Middlesex County. But their luck ran out halfway to Concord. A British patrol, part of the advance guard sent ahead of the main column, captured both. Revere and Dawes, the soldiers, members of the elite light infantry companies, had been watching the roads for exactly such messengers. They interrogated Revere roughly, demanding to know the rebels' plans and threatening him with dire consequences. Only Dr. Prescott escaped, spurring his horse over a stone wall and disappearing into the darkness, racing through the countryside by moonlight, dodging British patrols and following deer paths known since his childhood. Prescott reached Concord just before dawn. His warning allowed the townspeople to hide most of their military supplies before the British arrived. As dawn approached on April 19th, the British column was still miles from their destination, but the countryside around them was already alive with activity. Church bells rang out across Massachusetts, calling the militia to arms. Signal fires blazed from hilltop to hilltop, spreading the alarm faster than any horse could travel. The surprise attack that General Gage had planned was rapidly becoming a march into a hornet's nest of angry colonists. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith cursed under his breath as he led his column of British regulars along the winding road from Lexington to Concord. The morning sun was climbing higher, and with it, his growing sense that this simple mission was spiraling beyond his control. What should have been a swift, secret raid was becoming a daylight parade through increasingly hostile territory. Smith was an experienced officer, having served with distinction in the siege of Havana during the 7 Years' War, but nothing in his military career had prepared him for this new kind of warfare, facing an entire countryside that seemed to be mobilizing against him. From every hilltop and forest edge, he could see figures watching his column, shadowing their movements like wolves following a wounded deer. The British force was impressive by colonial standards. 700 men from the elite companies of 11 different regiments. These were not the raw recruits that would later fight in the wilderness campaigns, but seasoned soldiers who had served in Europe and the Caribbean. Their redcoats gleamed in the morning sunlight, their equipment was perfectly maintained, and their discipline was beyond question. Major John Pitcairn, riding at the head of the light infantry companies, tried to maintain the confidence that had carried him through the confrontation at Lexington. But the major was beginning to understand what many British officers would learn. Over the next 8 years, this was not a conventional enemy they faced. These colonists didn't follow European rules of warfare. They didn't mass their forces in open fields for decisive battles. Instead, they seemed to materialize from behind every stone wall and barn, only to vanish again like morning mist. As recorded in the detailed reports later filed with the British War Office, the countryside around them was transforming with frightening speed. Smoke signals rose from distant hills. Church bells continued their urgent tolling, the sound carrying for miles across the spring landscape. Most ominously, the British could see groups of armed men moving parallel to their line of march, staying just out of musket range, but clearly tracking their every move. Captain Walter Larry, commanding the light infantry companies, sent scouts ahead to probe the route to Concord. Their reports were increasingly troubling. Bridges were being prepared for destruction. Cattle were being driven away from the roads to deny forage to British horses, and civilian families were evacuating their homes with suspicious haste. This was not the behavior of a cowed population. This was a people preparing for war. The terrain itself seemed to work against the British column. The road from Lexington to Concord wound through rolling hills covered with stone walls, dense woodlands, and scattered farms. Every bend could hide an ambush. Every hill crest could reveal a line of rebel muskets. The British formation, designed for European battlefields, felt clumsy and vulnerable on these narrow country lanes. Smith had sent word back to Boston calling for reinforcements, but relief was hours away. His men were already showing signs of fatigue from their night march, and the morning was growing uncomfortably warm for soldiers in heavy wool uniforms. Worse, their mission required speed. The longer they remained in hostile territory, the more time the rebels had to organize resistance. At 9 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours after leaving Boston, the British column finally crested the last hill before Concord. Below them lay the small Massachusetts town that had become the secret arsenal of the rebellion. Concord was larger than Lexington, with perhaps 1,500 inhabitants, but it looked deceptively peaceful in the morning sunlight. Smoke rose from breakfast fires, and the Concord River meandered lazily through the valley. But appearances were deceiving. Even as Smith's advance guard entered the town, armed men were moving through the forests around Concord like pieces on a chessboard. Colonel James Barrett, commander of the Middlesex County Militia, had been planning for this day for months. His men knew every path, every hiding place, every strategic position in 20 miles of countryside. The British quickly occupied the town center, posting guards at key buildings and beginning their search for hidden weapons. They found some supplies, musket balls, flour, wooden gun carriages, but far less than intelligence reports had suggested. Most of the rebel arsenal had already been moved or hidden, thanks to Dr. Prescott's warning and the efficient network of Patriot communications. As Smith's men began their systematic search, more militia companies were arriving from surrounding towns. Acton, Bedford, Westford, Littleton men were coming from every direction, drawn by the alarm that had spread across Massachusetts like wildfire. These weren't professional soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their rights as Englishmen. The stage was set for the day's decisive confrontation, though neither side yet realized how dramatically the world was about to change. Colonel James Barrett stood on Punkatasset Hill overlooking Concord, watching through his spyglass as British soldiers systematically searched his town below. The 5 to 7-year-old Miller had spent months preparing for this moment, organizing the Middlesex County Militia and establishing hidden supply depots throughout the region. Now, as he counted the growing number of militia companies gathering around him, Barrett realized the time for preparation had ended. The British had divided their forces upon entering Concord around 8 in the morning. Lieutenant Colonel Smith kept the main body in the town center, while Captain Laurie led 3 companies of light infantry to secure the North Bridge over the Concord River. It was a tactically sound decision. The bridge represented the only crossing point for miles and controlled access to the countryside beyond. But Barrett knew something the British did not. Most of the military supplies they sought had already been moved to his farm, 2 miles north of the bridge. More importantly, militia companies from across Massachusetts were converging on Concord like spokes of a wheel. From his hilltop position, Barrett could see dust clouds marking the approach of men from Acton, Bedford, Westford, Lincoln, and a dozen other towns. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton had arrived with his company of Minutemen, their uniforms crisp and their equipment the finest that colonial craftsmanship could provide. Davis was a gunsmith by trade, and his men were armed with rifles of his own, making weapons more accurate than the standard British Brown Bess musket. Standing beside him was Major John Buttrick of Concord, whose intimate knowledge of local terrain would prove crucial in the coming fight. As the morning progressed, the British search in the town center grew more aggressive. Soldiers dumped flour in the streets, chopped down the town's Liberty Pole, and set fire to wooden gun carriages they discovered in the courthouse. The smoke from these fires, visible from Punkatasset Hill, sent a surge of anger through the assembled militia. According to accounts preserved in the Concord town records, someone shouted, "Will you let them burn the town down?" Barrett made his decision. At 10:30 in the morning, he gave the order to advance on North Bridge. 400 colonial militia began moving down the hill in a formation that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. These were farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, and ministers. but they moved with the discipline of veteran soldiers. The months of training and organization were paying off. Major Buttrick led the advance, followed by Captain Davis and his Acton Minutemen. The colonial force included men whose names would become legendary in American history: Lieutenant Colonel John Robinson, Captain David Brown, and the Reverend William Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's grandfather, who had come not to fight, but to witness history. At the bridge, Captain Laurie's 96 British light infantrymen found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. They had been ordered to hold the bridge, but they were facing odds of more than 4-1. The narrow span offered no room for maneuver, and the approaching colonists showed none of the hesitation that had marked the earlier confrontation at Lexington. The British began falling back across the bridge, some soldiers attempting to remove the wooden planks to prevent a crossing, but there was no time for proper demolition work. The militia was advancing steadily, their officers maintaining perfect control over what could easily have become a mob charge. Major Buttrick, walking at the front of the colonial line, called out the order that would echo through American history: "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" The North Bridge erupted in smoke and flame as both sides opened fire at point-blank range. Unlike the brief skirmish at Lexington, this was a sustained exchange between formed bodies of troops. Captain Davis fell in the first volley, a British musket ball piercing his heart. Private Abner Hosmer of Acton died beside him, and several other colonists were wounded, but the British suffered worse casualties. 2 soldiers were killed instantly and several others wounded, including 4 officers. The narrow confines of the bridge had turned the engagement into a brutal close-quarters fight. Faced with overwhelming numbers and unable to form proper defensive lines, the British light infantry broke and retreated toward Concord town center. It was the first time in the American Revolution that British regulars had been forced to retreat by colonial militia, and the psychological impact was enormous. Word of the victory at North Bridge would spread across the colonies within days, proving that the mighty British Army could be beaten. As Captain Laurie's demoralized troops fell back through Concord, Barrett's militia controlled the field. They had won their first real battle against professional European soldiers, but both sides understood that this was only the beginning. The British still had to return to Boston, and the countryside between Concord and the sea was rapidly filling with angry colonists who had heard the news from Lexington and North Bridge. By noon on April 19, 1775, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith faced a commander's nightmare. His mission to destroy rebel supplies in Concord had failed. His force was surrounded by an ever-growing swarm of colonial militia, and he was 18 miles from the safety of Boston. With no clear retreat route, the disciplined raid he had planned had become a desperate fight for survival. The retreat began in good order around 12 o'clock, with British light infantry forming the advance guard and grenadiers protecting the rear. Smith's 700 regulars maintained their formation as they marched through Concord's town center, past curious civilians who watched from doorways and windows. But the colonel knew that once his column entered the countryside, the real battle would begin. The colonists had learned valuable lessons from the morning's fighting. At Lexington, they had faced the British in traditional European fashion and been overwhelmed. At North Bridge, concentrated fire had driven off the enemy, but only after suffering casualties they could ill afford. Now, as militia companies from across eastern Massachusetts converged on the British retreat route, a new form of warfare was emerging. Dr. Joseph Warren, who had ridden out from Boston to observe the fighting, later described the scene in letters preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society. The countryside had become a vast battlefield, with every stone wall and farmhouse a potential fortress. The British found themselves under constant harassment from an enemy they could rarely see and never decisively engage. The first serious attack came at Miriam's Corner, where the road from Concord crossed a narrow bridge. Militia companies from Reading and Billerica had positioned themselves behind stone walls on both sides of the crossing, creating a deadly funnel that the British had no choice but to traverse. As the redcoats approached the bridge, concealed muskets opened fire from multiple directions. Major Pitcairn's light infantry tried to deploy and attack the militia positions, but the colonists simply melted away into the surrounding woods and farmlands, only to reappear further along the retreat route. This was warfare unlike anything in British military manuals. An entire population seemed to be shooting at them from behind every obstacle. The British formation began to stretch and fragment under the constant pressure. Wounded soldiers slowed the column's pace, while the need to guard against attacks from all directions prevented Smith from concentrating his forces effectively. The precise ranks that had marched out of Boston were dissolving into a desperate mass of exhausted men stumbling toward safety. At the hamlet of Lincoln, the situation deteriorated further. Captain William Smith of Lincoln had positioned his company in the woods overlooking the road, while militia from Lexington thirsting for revenge. After the morning's casualties attacked the British flanks, the road itself became a killing ground, with colonists firing from houses, barns, and stone walls in a continuous running battle. British casualties mounted steadily. Officers, easily identified by their distinctive uniforms and equipment, became priority targets for colonial marksmen. Many of these militia were experienced hunters who could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with their civilian fowling pieces at close range. Shooting at large formations of soldiers in bright red coats, they were devastatingly effective. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical casualties. British soldiers were trained to fight disciplined enemies who followed established rules of warfare. Instead, they faced an invisible enemy that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. Men who had served with distinction in European campaigns found themselves shooting at shadows and jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. By mid-afternoon, Smith's column was disintegrating. Soldiers were abandoning their heavy equipment, discarding knapsacks and extra ammunition to move faster. The wounded were being carried by their comrades, further slowing the retreat. Most ominously, ammunition was running dangerously low. The British had not planned for a sustained fighting withdrawal across 18 miles of hostile territory. At Fisk Hill, near Lexington, the crisis reached its peak. A large force of militia had assembled to block the British advance, while other companies pressed in from the flanks and rear. Smith himself was wounded in the thigh, and Major Pitcairn's horse was shot from under him. The entire British force seemed on the verge of collapse, surrounded by an estimated 1,500 colonial militia, who showed no sign of letting them escape. Then, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, salvation appeared on the horizon. Lord Hugh Percy's relief column of 1,000 fresh British troops crested the hill near Lexington, their regimental colors flying and their artillery pieces gleaming in the afternoon sun. General Gage had finally responded to Smith's desperate calls for reinforcement, though whether the rescue had come in time remained to be seen. The running battle from Concord to Lexington had lasted for hours and covered 6 miles of Massachusetts countryside. It had demonstrated that colonial militia could match British regulars in sustained combat, and it had introduced a new form of warfare that would characterize much of the American Revolution. The shot fired that morning at Lexington Green had indeed been heard around the world. Lord Hugh Percy, son of the Duke of Northumberland and one of Britain's most promising young officers, had watched the smoke rising over the Massachusetts countryside with growing alarm. The 22-year-old brigadier general commanded the 1st Brigade of British forces in Boston, and when General Thomas Gage ordered him to march with reinforcements, Percy understood that something had gone terribly wrong with Smith's expedition. Percy's relief force was formidable, 1,000 fresh troops from the 4th, 23rd, and 47th Regiments of foot, supported by 6-pound artillery pieces. These were seasoned soldiers who had served in the Caribbean and European theaters, and they marched with the confidence of men who had never been defeated by colonial irregulars. Percy himself was a veteran of European campaigns, having purchased his commission at age 11 and served with distinction in Portugal and Germany. But as Percy's column approached Lexington around 4 o'clock on the afternoon of April 19, 1775, the young lord received his first harsh lesson in American warfare. Colonial militia had occupied the high ground around the town, and as the British relief force deployed into battle formation, hidden muskets began picking off soldiers from concealed positions. The artillery proved decisive in breaking the immediate threat to Smith's exhausted column. Percy's 6-pounders, loaded with grape shot, swept the militia from their positions around Lexington Green with devastating effect. The psychological impact was enormous. Most of the colonists had never faced artillery fire, and the shriek of iron balls through the air sent many diving for cover. Smith's battered force stumbled into the protective embrace of Percy's fresh troops like survivors reaching shore after a shipwreck. The exhausted regulars collapsed where they stood, many too tired to speak. Their uniforms were torn, their equipment scattered, and their faces bore the haunted expressions of men who had stared defeat in the face. Percy quickly assessed the situation. With the cool efficiency that had made him one of Britain's youngest Generals, Smith's force was spent, having fought a running battle for 6 miles against an estimated 2,000 colonial militia. Ammunition was critically low, casualties were mounting, and the enemy showed no signs of disengaging. Most troubling, Percy could see fresh militia companies still arriving from distant towns, suggesting that the rebellion was far more widespread than London had believed. The combined British force now numbered over 1,600 men, making it the largest military formation in North America. But Percy understood that numbers meant little when facing an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles. As his officers reorganized the shattered remnants of Smith's column, the young general made the fateful decision to begin an immediate withdrawal to Boston, according to dispatches preserved in the British National Archives. Percy later wrote that the rebels attacked us in a very scattered, irregular manner, but with perseverance and resolution, nor did they ever dare to form into any regular body. This assessment, while accurate, missed the fundamental transformation taking place in American military thinking. The colonists were abandoning European tactics in favor of a new form of warfare, perfectly suited to their terrain and resources. The retreat from Lexington began at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with Percy's artillery clearing the immediate approaches to the town. But as soon as the British column moved onto the open road, the harassment resumed with renewed intensity. Militia companies that had been scattered by the cannon fire reformed in the woods and continued their relentless pressure on the British flanks and rear guard. The road from Lexington to Cambridge became a corridor of continuous violence. At every stone wall, every farmhouse, every patch of woodland, colonial militia opened fire and then melted away before British infantry could close with them. Percy's men found themselves shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows, expending precious ammunition against a largely invisible enemy. The British general tried every tactical solution his training suggested. He deployed light infantry to sweep the woods, but the militia simply fell back and reappeared elsewhere. He sent cavalry to disperse groups of rebels, but horses proved vulnerable to aim fire from concealed positions. He even ordered houses, suspected of harboring snipers, to be burned. But this only increased colonial anger without reducing the military pressure. As afternoon turned to evening, Percy's situation became increasingly desperate. His ammunition wagons were under constant attack, forcing him to detach precious infantry to guard the supply train. Casualties continued to mount, particularly among officers who made tempting targets for colonial marksmen. Most critically, the pace of retreat was slowing as exhausted soldiers struggled to maintain formation. Under constant fire at Menominee, modern-day Arlington, the fighting reached a new level of intensity. Jason Russell, a 58-year-old farmer, had declared that he would not run from his own house when British soldiers broke into his home pursuing suspected snipers. Russell died defending his doorway with an ancient musket. His death became a symbol of colonial determination that would inspire resistance for years to come. By 7 o'clock in the evening, as the spring sun began to set over Massachusetts, Percy's force was still 3 miles from the safety of Charlestown Neck. Behind them, the road was marked by abandoned equipment, bloodstains, and the occasional body of a soldier who had fallen out of formation and been overwhelmed by pursuing militia. Ahead lay the final gauntlet, the approach to Charlestown, where the rebels had had all day to prepare their strongest positions. As darkness began to fall over eastern Massachusetts on April 19, 1775, Lord Percy's battered column struggled through the final miles toward Charlestown Neck. The young British general had learned more about American warfare in one afternoon than most European officers would understand in years of campaigning. His force, once the pride of the British Army in North America, now resembled a defeated rabble fleeing for their lives. The approach to Charlestown presented Percy with his greatest challenge yet. The narrow causeway leading to the peninsula was perfect for a final ambush, and colonial militia had been fortifying positions there since word of the fighting first reached Cambridge. Dr. Joseph Warren, who had been coordinating rebel communications throughout the day, had positioned his strongest companies to guard this crucial bottleneck. But Percy had one final card to play. HMS Somerset, the same 64-gun ship of the line that had nearly intercepted Paul Revere the night before, lay anchored in Boston Harbor with her massive guns trained on the approaches to Charlestown. As Percy's advance guard reached the causeway, Somerset's cannons opened fire, sending 18-pound iron balls crashing into the colonial positions. The naval bombardment proved decisive. Militia companies that had been preparing to contest every yard of the causeway scattered under the overwhelming firepower of Somerset's broadside. The psychological impact was enormous. Few colonists had ever experienced the terror of naval artillery, and the shriek of massive cannonballs overhead sent many running for cover. Percy's exhausted troops stumbled across Charlestown Neck as the last light faded from the western sky. Behind them, the road from Concord was littered with the detritus of their retreat, abandoned knapsacks, discarded weapons, blood-stained equipment, and the bodies of men who had started the day as proud soldiers of the king. The toll was devastating: 73 British dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, presumed captured or killed. Colonial casualties were remarkably light by comparison. 49 Americans had died and 39 were wounded in the day's fighting, a testament to their effective use of cover and terrain. More importantly, they had proven that British regulars could be beaten by properly organized militia. The psychological victory was worth more than any tactical advantage. As Percy's men collapsed behind the defensive works of Charlestown, a remarkable transformation was taking place across Massachusetts. The alarm that had started with Paul Revere's midnight ride was still spreading, carried by an elaborate network of riders, signal fires, and church bells. According to records preserved by the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, over 4,000 militia were already marching toward Boston from across New England. General Thomas Gage, waiting anxiously in Boston for news of the expedition, received Percy's initial reports with growing dismay. The simple mission to destroy rebel supplies had become a military disaster that would reshape British strategy in North America. More importantly, it had united the colonies in armed resistance to British rule. By dawn on April 20th, the transformation was complete. What had begun as scattered protests against British policies had become open warfare between the Crown and its American subjects. Boston, once the commercial heart of New England, was now a besieged city surrounded by an army of angry colonists who had proven they could match British regulars in battle. The siege of Boston would last 11 months, tying down thousands of British troops who were desperately needed elsewhere in the growing rebellion. It would force Britain to treat the American conflict as a full-scale war, rather than a police action requiring massive reinforcements and naval support. Most significantly, it would give the Continental Congress time to organize, declare independence, and seek foreign allies. News of Lexington and Concord spread across the American colonies with unprecedented speed. Within a week, riders had carried word to Georgia and the Carolinas. Within a month, the story had reached London, where King George III and his ministers finally understood that they faced not a local rebellion, but a continental revolution. The shot fired on Lexington Green that misty morning had indeed been heard round the world. As Ralph Waldo Emerson would later write, it had announced the birth of a new nation and the beginning of a war that would last 8 years, cost thousands of lives, and ultimately established the United States of America as an independent rep. The farmers and merchants who had faced British bayonets at dawn on April 19th could not have imagined the consequences of their actions. They had gone to bed as British subjects and awakened as American revolutionaries. In defending their homes and their rights, they had started a war that would reshape the balance of power across the globe and inspire democratic revolutions for generations to come. The Battle of Lexington and Concord was over, but the American Revolution had only just begun.